think this class number 8 about the progressive era is very appropriate when you sit and you look at what's going on around the world in many countries. You have people fighting for their rights. You have people, labor unions trying to get better working conditions for their employees. You have civil rights. You have populism everywhere you can look. Politicians are promising the utopias that never happen. You have newspapers that are looking for all the dirt that they can possibly find, called muckrakers. And you have people arguing whether how much government is too much government, and all the other evils that are destroying. We don't have temperance on alcohol, but we have forbidden drugs, and that's always an argument too. So the real question here is why 115 years ago we had or even more, we had a large group of people in the United States, a large percentage, that demanded the government do something because of all the evils that they saw in society, and they sincerely believed that things could be made better if some people, and particularly those who had the power to do something, would do something. So when you talk about progressivism, think about the problems in your own state or your own country or wherever it is, and what would you do, what could you do to go about resolving these problems? Who do you turn to for help? In the United States, we hope that we can get some kind of response from local municipal authorities. We know if the house catches fire, the firemen will probably come quickly, and the policemen are pretty quick to respond too. But in other places, the firemen may or may not come, and the police, if they do come, might be worse than the problems you're already in. What steps need to be taken? And I put this in here, this little YouTube link, so that you could go to the YouTube and find more information and appreciate better what progressivism was and what was driving this political movement. The bosses in the 1900s, say 1870, 1900, the bosses were the political bosses, and the political bosses still exist in most places in the world, and they control the people, and they control through populist government, promising people everything, and then actually political bosses on the what we call the grassroots level actually do solve some of the problems for people that the people themselves, unless they get together in large numbers, really don't have any political power, so they turn to the bosses. Crony capitalism simply means that when you get elected, you give all your friends jobs, government jobs. It happens here, it happens in many places. In the United States, crony capitalism was pretty much eliminated 100 years ago because of the creation of the civil service system, and the complaint that the state governments don't represent its constituents. And I hear that complaint. Most people here don't even know who their national congressman are. They don't know. And then corruption. What can you say about corruption? It's at all levels. Everything you can possibly imagine in those days was corrupt. You couldn't get anything without bribing someone, or exchanging favors, being put on somebody's favor list, but usually just outright bribes. Corrupt business practices, environmental damage, monopolies, for the development of antitrust laws. Utilities or monopolies, with no one was controlling the rates, how much these companies charge for providing water or electricity or whatever. Something I mentioned in the last class about the commanding heights of an economy would be the major utilities in any place. And who should have control over these major utilities? In socialism, the socialists say that the government has to control them for the better of the people, but then socialism turns into gross corruption too, and incompetence, and these things don't work with government controlling these businesses or any business. Dangerous jobs, no safety rules, regulations. You didn't have to. You look around today, people have to wear protective eye protection, ear protection, helmets. They have to wear the vest to protect their backs. You have to wear steel-toed shoes. There was nothing like that. And if you got hurt, big deal. We'll just replace you with someone else. There was no workman's compensation. women and children working long hours, 50, 60, 70 hours a week, 12 hours a day. No one did anything about it. The reform movement started in the 1870s, but by the 1890s was really strong, and population moving away. This is the question. Americans believe, and still do very strongly, one of the reasons for the failure of socialism in United States history is Americans, they have more limits and desire for free, laissez-faire capitalism than they do for the equality of socialist legislation. One of the reasons for the failure of some democratic efforts like Bill Clinton, the current government, Barack Obama has a lot of trouble. The failure of Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s and the New Deal was basically because people just simply said, no, we don't want to go that far with socialism. Yes, we'll have Social Security in the 1930s. We'll have food stamps. We'll take care of the poor people, but there are limits. Make government responsible and responsive to the people. That was a major part of it, and it took a long time. You don't change government, you don't change people's attitudes, you don't change social society and culture in one term of any one particular president. No president comes in and changes everything all of a sudden. It just doesn't work. And then the people get very disillusioned, and when the next populist comes along, they jump to that person's side. And then when the next one comes along, because that one didn't succeed, they just jump back and forth. Government curbed power of wealthy and protect the citizens. The people deeply resented the super wealthy. In the United States, we don't resent wealthy people unless it's blatant and in your face with huge mansions. I've been to Newport, Rhode Island. When I was in the Navy, we were stationed down there for a while. These monstrous mansions belonging to the very few. If you go to New York City someday, all you have to do is walk up the west side of Central Park and look at these huge apartment buildings with $100 million apartments. The penthouses are 4 stories high. People resented that kind of thing, and there was an extremely unequal distribution, and that still goes on. Limit the power of the political bosses means take power away from these, I don't know, you could say they were crooks. They were. And give more power to the people. Clean up the cities. Great movement to clean up the cities. They were filthy. I have a book somewhere. The good old days weren't so good. They were pretty nasty when you found out what was going on in the cities and what was not going on. Areas of reform: social justice, political democracy, economic equality, and conservation, especially when Theodore Roosevelt becomes president. We'll get to that very soon. The muckrakers that I mentioned quickly a few slides ago was a name. Muck itself is a word for the slop you see in Spanish you call alcantarilla. It's mud and dirt and doggy stuff, and it's just everything. Well, muckrakers, to rake means if you have this piece of hand equipment, it's shaped like a broom, but it's used for raking up leaves, and you can be raking. Chinese or Japanese use it for raking their gardens very beautifully. Muck rakers are people who dig through the muck, the dirt of society and of culture, looking for the abuses of government, the corruption of government, the excesses and abuses of wealth and power, and printing it in their newspapers. We have currently have a very anti-newspaper government in this country where I live now, and they felt that the press feels its responsibility to expose these excessive abuses of government to the people. So they force the government, because it is a government, or supposedly a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. But in those days, it was not for the people; it was of the government, of the politicians, by the politicians, and for the politicians. So it's investigative journalism. And they called it yellow journalism because they printed it on a cheap newspaper, which turned yellow very quickly. Progressives exposed corruption but offered no solutions. That means you're fighting an uphill battle trying to stop government corruption. Every government that we have promises to stop corruption, and every government leaves sooner or later, having not stopped corruption and maybe even made it worse. Progressivism was a maturity of the American culture. When you go back even before we have in this course, before the Civil War, and you look at the beginnings of the country, it was very idealistic, but people didn't really know what they wanted in the United States, but they knew they wanted something special. By the end of the 1800s, the 19th century, they felt that they didn't have something special. They had been through a civil war and one incompetent or corrupt government after another, after another, after another. But the culture is beginning to mature, and only through that maturity and also increase in the number of people in the middle class, lower middle, middle, and upper middle. But the more they earn, the more they own, the stronger their political power, and then they began to demand more changes. The upper class, they don't want to change anything. They like it the way it is. The lower class, they can't change anything. They are what they are, and they know that there's not much social mobility or economic mobility, so they're stuck where they are. It's the middle class, in almost all instances in history, that causes social and cultural and economic change. Origins from the bottom up. The reaction to the extremes of modern life was very upsetting to people. Modern transportation was scary. I remember reading that when they developed a steam train in the early 1800s, 1810s, 1820s, they thought if you went over 15 miles an hour, you were going to suffocate or something because there's no oxygen at that speed. The modern life would mean people leaving the farms. They're leaving that tranquil life of being on the farm, although it may be a little more tranquil, but it's certainly a strenuous life. And moving to cities, and cities themselves, they lose their social groups, they lose their cultural groups. They have to intermingle with other people from other groups, and particularly when the immigrants start really, really exploding in the major municipal areas in the United States, people are very uncertain. People coming in with other religions, other languages, other food, other customs, and a lot of them. If you look at countries here, I was just thinking where have been major immigrant groups, maybe in Argentina with these Italians, maybe in Chile with a lot of German. There's a strong German influence, especially in southern Chile. I can't think that there are any in Ecuador or Colombia, maybe with the Asians, but there's not many. There are more Chinese here right now, but not a lot of Japanese and not a lot of people from other Asian countries. When I came 25 years ago, there were a lot of Americans. There aren't that many anymore. Capitalism and individualism simply means that people still believe that they, as American citizens, have the right to benefit from the fruits of their labor. And even though they're demanding more government protection, they also want the government to protect them and their right to prosper. Work long and work hard and be prosperous, and don't take it away from you. Labor conflict, what that's all about is that people who begin to work in industry, and they begin to organize labor unions to demand better working conditions and their human rights and more and higher income, higher pay. Immigration I've mentioned, in the 1870s, 80s, 90s, up until the 1920s, millions of people went to the United States. Boatloads full. Someday, if you ever get a chance, you must go to New York City and go to the Immigrant Museum on Ellis Island, right next to the Statue of Liberty. And the stressful social problems, well, we'll get to temperament, which means eventually we have a law that prohibits alcohol, prostitution, alcoholism, poverty, child labor. I'm just picking things off the top of my head. The characteristics of progressivism, it was driven by the morality of the middle class. You have to always remember that in the United States, although some people don't believe this, it's an extremely religious country. A Protestant, Presbyterians, Methodists, Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, Baptists, you just go on and on and on. And they have a very strong sense of morality. And they believed that allowing the picture is funny because the big businesses take more and more and more, and the big businesses through their trusts were in collusion to take more and more and more and give less and less and less. And they wanted moderation in these kind of things. They believed in the scientific method. They believed in order and stability, and that order and stability should be provided by government through laws that were applied, and violations of the laws were sanctioned by government, an active government, and the collective responsibility of the people. Conservation of resources, particularly Theodore Roosevelt becomes our first eco-president, the first one who understood the dangers facing all humanity by the destruction of the forests in the Wests. I read a book recently about Theodore Roosevelt after he was president going into the Amazon jungle to find the origin of a particular river. I don't even remember the name of the river, but that's a pretty strong adventure. He almost died. Assimilation, simply meaning that people need to learn to assimilate more into the majority culture. The social gospel, meaning that the new immigrants, they had to become Americans, and professional organizations. Americans are very strong in joining professional organizations. When I lived in the States, I was, and I still am a highest degree Mason, which you call the Mason. Belong to the Grange, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, YMCA, boys clubs, girls clubs, all kinds of different. In high school, they encourage you to join the future nurses, the future farmers. I don't know, maybe today it's the future astronauts or future programmers, and the protest against corporate kleptocracy. Kleptocracy is compulsive stealing, and the corporations are guilty. Economic extremes, corporate control of industry and resources. Rockefeller, you have to go to the YouTube and find the story of Rockefeller and Standard Oil. It's just absolute monopoly, never giving anyone a chance. No competition allowed, according to Mr. Rockefeller. Carnegie wasn't quite that bad. The railroads were. And American people considered all of this anti-democratic. Everyone deserves a fair chance, but the big companies, they bought off all the politicians, they bought off the judges and lawyers, and people were protesting against this. Theodore Roosevelt, when he becomes president, in his left hand is the head of Rockefeller, and I'm not sure about the guy on his right hand, but both are the culebras, the snakes, the hydra that he had to tend with when little Teddy became president, because they had more power than he did, because they had money. Standard Oil of 1906, Ida Tarbell's book exposes the abuses of Standard Oil with horizontal and vertical expansion in the industry. You can see over on the right-hand side the one tentacle coiled around the White House and the Capitol. Now it's the Capitol building, and the others are coiled around other businesses, and he controls everything, and he did. The other extreme, well, if you've got all this abuse by government, and you've got all this abuse, or let's say abuse and inactivity by government, and the abuse of business, there's going to be, and there was, a reaction. And the reaction was labor unions, anarchism, socialism. In the 1870s, 80s, 90s, the rise of anarchy and anarchism in Europe. And the Americans are watching this kind of thing. Anarchism, people blowing up, killing the Tsar of Russia. I remember, I'm trying to think of who it was. It was a wife of the Austrian-Hungarian emperor, was stabbed to death in Geneva, by the lake in Geneva, Switzerland, I think. I'm not sure. Maybe it was Zurich. Rise of anarchy and socialism. Socialism scared them. Strikes and protests scared big business. And the middle class. The middle class are looking for stability. The Knights of Labor are labor unions, the American Federation of Labor, populist political parties promising all the things that they can't come through with. And the United Mine Workers I put there in honor of my mother because she thought that John Lewis was the great hero of her generation of the 1920s and 30s. And this is just an example. The Triangle Shirtwaist Fire was an example of the abuses of people who owned industries. I think it was 9 or 10-story building in New York City catches fire. On the floors, upper floors, there's many young women, mostly very young, and immigrants working, making a shirtwaist, which was like a shirt without a collar on it, because in those days these collars were not attached to the shirt. And you can go to that YouTube site and you should see, and then think about these people that started a fire because somebody threw a cigarette on the floor and there's cloth and thread laying all over the place. The doors were locked. The fire doors were locked, so they couldn't get out because the owners of the business wanted to make sure they weren't leaving with things in their pocketbooks. And the people, 146 young women, died, jumping out of 9th and 8th story windows or just dying in the fire. And it was a great scandal nationwide. Here's a nice picture of some of the bodies. I'll throw that in for excitement. Muckraker pictures, no doubt. And it caused the city, to begin with, to make laws to protect the workers. Immigration and progressivism, 9 million immigrants between 1900 and 1910. What does that do? It upsets the equilibrium. The immigrants came in, even the ones that spoke English. The Irish speak English, but it's a very different. I lived in Ireland for a year. You got to get an ear to understand Irish English. Strange, like I mentioned before, strange customs. They hang around with each other, and you see the same dynamic. And you go to many American cities today. The Hispanic people. I always tell my students, the Hispanic people don't mix with other people. And I tell my students, when you go to university in the States, don't isolate yourself and surround yourself with only Spanish-speaking students. That's not a good way to to get the benefit of going to school and building a social network that may come in very, very important in your life someday. If you're only hanging around, I have a group of people right now. Some of my students are at Bentley University outside of Boston, and another group of about 12 are at University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And I notice, because their Facebooks are pretty clear, they don't hang around with anybody else, Americans or anybody else. So I try to guide them in the right direction. Immigration becomes an issue. Americans continue to be racist. They are exclusionist. These people call themselves nativists because they are the 2nd, 3rd, 4th generation, and they believe that more immigrants coming into the United States is going to take jobs from them. So you have a whole list of anti-immigration laws. Immigration Act, tax idiots, lunatics, convicts, persons likely to become a public. Here, the 1917 Immigration Act, all idiots, imbeciles, feeble-minded persons, epileptics, insane persons, persons who have had one or more attacks of insanity at any time previously, persons of constitutional psychopathic inferiority, persons with chronic alcoholism, paupers, professional beggars, and so on and so on and so on. These people have to be excluded from moving to the United States, immigrating. This is simply about that there were some people, and mostly it starts with women, that were very aware that there were things that could be done to help to better the lives of the poor people and immigrants. And they started things called settlement houses, a group, and it was definitely approved of and worked. People who were in the progressive movement worked for it. This was the condition of the cities. Public health, really, really, really dangerous. No running water, no sewage systems. There's some places outside of Guayaquil, and I'm sure on the edges of Lima, Peru, too, that are questionable. Tenement living, many people living in one apartment or 2 apartments, and many families in an apartment. No zoning. Zoning is the local municipal laws of what kind of business you can have in a particular. Is it a residential area or is it a business area? And if so, what kind of business? Is it retail, restaurants, offices, that kind of thing? and then disease. And then you can go look at the YouTube about this guy named Jacob Riss, who was a muckraking writer who wrote about how the other half lives and brought to the attention of the public how poor people lived. Progressive journalism, I mentioned Ida Tarbell already, the rise to consciousness of Americans. All of this, you have to remember, was happening in the 1880s, 90s, 1910, kind of dies out in the 1920s after the First World War. But you could say that the Democratic Party still remains somewhat populist, although both political parties do make an awful lot of promises. The Jungle is about a book that I had to read many years ago about the meatpacking industry, and there are some contemporary books. Fast Food Nation's the one I was thinking of. What was the other one? I didn't remember. It was about don't eat at McDonald's and Burger King and those kind of places, because you don't know Kentucky Fried Chicken. You don't know what they do to put that burger on your bun. Eugenics is important to think about, because in those days the medical field was still pretty new. They just learned about, well, when we talk about the Panama Canal, they would just, because of the Panama Canal, they discovered that it was the malaria was caused by mosquitoes. They didn't know that. Well, they also had ideas of racial superiority, which is used later by Adolf Hitler and the Nazis in the 1930s. Social Darwinism simply means that, in accordance with the theories of Darwin, that the fittest survive. They twisted it around, saying that I am rich because I deserve to be rich because I saved my money or I worked very hard, and you don't, and you didn't, and whatever circumstance you were born in, well, that's just too bad. No miscegenation simply means no mixing of the races. And if you really read history someday, you will notice that in North America, the English did not mix very much with the indigenous people, where in Central and South America, the Spanish did mix very much, and that was considered in North America, that was a crime. Anti-immigration, racial purity, the pureness of the white-blooded race, and like I said, these things later, not many years later, 1930, Hitler uses them in Germany. The environment, this is John Muir sitting at the top there with his beard and his stick, was a great environmentalist, and Gifford Pinchot also created the monstrous national parks. Another wonderful thing in the United States is the tens of hundreds and millions of acres of parks, forests that are protected for the future of our children. The one I particularly enjoy, even in the cities, if you look at Central Park in New York City, but someday you have to go to the Grand Canyon, and you have to go to Yellowstone National Park. That's another wonderful thrill. I put this in here because I'm particularly connected to child labor and coal miners, like this little boy on the right looks like he's about 12, 13, 14 years old. My grandfather and my uncles and their grandfather before them were all coal miners. My uncles, I think they had first or second grade education. My grandfather never went to school. Died at the dinner table when he was 42 years old from black lung disease, working in the mines in eastern Kentucky. No government regulations to protect them. The public schools, they had to work. They couldn't go to school. Immigrant labor, working class, it was prevalent. It was most common. And here's the great conservationist, Theodore Roosevelt. If you happen to have a teddy bear like I do, I still have my teddy bear that was given to me when I was 2 years old in 1947. He used his power as president. Teddy was one of the most interesting, maybe the most interesting. He's up there with the greatest, but one of the most fascinating persons I've ever read about in my life. A person who drinks like he drank a case of Red Bull a day, this guy, long before Red Bull was discovered. And when he became president, he went after everything, but one of his big issues was environmentalism, Active government. Government is responsible to the people, for the people. That's why we have a government. Americanization of the people. People who move to the United States need to be integrated into the society. And then Woodrow Wilson becomes president. And he's a Democrat. He was much more conservative. He was a president during the First World War. Reform legislation. Reform, Pure Food and Drug Act. The government has to go check, investigate any food packing places. Today it's common. You have the ingredients on all the things that you buy in the store. I remember when that was instituted, maybe 30 years ago or 40 years ago. The 16th Amendment was income taxes. Everybody has to pay income taxes. Not that everybody did right away. The big companies cheated on their income taxes. People still cheated on their income taxes in the United States, but not much. And then the 17th Amendment, that senators would be elected by the people, not appointed by Congress. Harrison Act regulates narcotics, which we still have a major issue worldwide. But I just read in the paper this morning, what was it, 1.3 tons of cocaine found in an Air France flight when it landed in Paris from Caracas, Venezuela. 1.3 tons is a lot of cocaine, I think. And the 18th Amendment, prohibition. We'll get to prohibition. There will be no more alcohol in the United States, either manufactured or transported or consumed. Very quickly appealed. In 1920, women finally get the right to vote. Racial equality. Blacks are still fighting for some kind of recognition as American citizens, and women progressives became very, very aggressive progressives, and pushed women's rights, and pushed the issues of temperance, prohibition, pushed for more public education, and there's some suffrage women. And the conclusion, what happens? Public reaction to extremes of modern life. That's what they did. They said, we've got to do something about this. We can't let the way the cities and the culture and the society is going, we can't let it continue. We have to do something about it. And that was the beginning of changing in the 20th century, even by the 1960s, 1950s, 1960s, Civil Rights Act, all kinds of things began to change because of progressivism. Thank you.